I would like to read something for you. People always ask, what is your favorite book? What is your favorite story? I think my favorite book right now is Waist Deep, but that's also the last one I released, so I think there's a little bit of a law of recency going on there. But they'd also ask, what's your favorite story? And that's hard to say, but I do have one story that has a little bit of a personal piece to it. It's also one of the shortest ones I've written, and I'd like to read that for you. It's called The Worst Door, and it's in the Dead Even anthology. Since I came on the job, it's the first door ever that I didn't want to go through. We stood lined up on the left side of the door, guns out and pointed to the ground, our ballistic vests hurriedly strapped over the top of our business casual attire. 2 uniformed cops brought up the rear for the purposes of backup and presence. A third stood on the right side of the door holding a steel door ram. I stared at the white words, "Knock, knock," scrawled on the side. "You ready, Finchy?" Elias asked me, his voice low. He kept his .357 tucked in tight to his chest and pointed downward like they taught us at the close quarters battle seminar last fall. I nodded my head yes, but the truth was I was anything but ready. Sure, my body was prepared to take the door, and the analytical part of my brain was prepared tactically, just like the 100 or so times I'd done this before. Only this time my heart raced like a trip hammer, and I wasn't sure if it was about to break or explode. "You sure?" Elias asked, his voice now almost a whisper. "Because you can hold the perimeter if you want. You don't have to go in." "Yeah," I said. "I do." Elias didn't sigh out loud, but I could see that response in his eyes. He didn't argue anymore, though. "I'll take point, then." I nodded my thanks. I knew he was doing it so that if anyone had to do any shooting, it would likely be him. That thought brought home the reality of the situation and shunted my physical readiness and tactical mindset for a moment. I really am standing outside this door, I thought. God damn it. There was a long silence while the other men stood still, tense with anticipation, like runners right before the start of a race. Elias was watching me. I took a shallow breath and blew the air out. "I'm ready," I told him. "Let's do this." Elias turned his head, made eye contact with each of the men, and gave a nod. The patrol officer behind me muttered a code into his radio to alert the officers stationed at the back door. I let my left hand fall away from my gun grip and flexed it nervously. Elias gave 3 exaggerated bobs with his head. On the third bob, the patrolman with the door ram swung it back like a sledgehammer. "River City Police!" Elias boomed. "Search warrant!" The ram crashed into the door just below the knob. The jam shattered. Elias dashed through the door, repeating his cry. I followed, automatically yelling out the entry mantra. "Police! Search warrant! Show me your hands! Down on the ground!" I've always wondered if, in the surprise of the entry and amidst the cacophony of sound, suspects were able to make out the specific commands we shouted at them. Or do they simply hold their hands up and go to their knees out of some kind of conditioned response, ingrained by years of watching television cop shows? I shook my head, dashing the thought away, like it mattered anyway, and an unfocused mind was what got cops killed. I moved through the house on Elias's tail. There were a pair of long hairs in the living room seated on the couch. Both of them had frozen and were staring at us in surprise, the first with a bong in his hands and smoke curling upward, and the other with a spoonful of Cocoa Puffs posed midway between the bowl and his mouth. One of the uniforms covered them, and Elias and I moved on. We found them in the bedroom, both half naked and stupid with sleep and hangover. I recognized the woman as a prostitute and a heroin junkie, though I couldn't recall her name. She clambered out of bed in a short T-shirt and no panties. I glanced at the blonde swatch of hair below her abdomen almost involuntarily, and then up at her washed-out face. She blinked rapidly at me, as if she couldn't decide if she were awake or dreaming. The man in the bed was my brother. He sat up, shirtless, and raised his hands above his shoulder. On the scarred nightstand next to the bed lay a bent spoon, needles, and a black 9mm. I heard Elias's voice raise an octave when he ordered him away from it. My brother leaned his tattooed body away from the gun and swung his legs over the side of the bed. He seemed stunned and unsure whether to show compliance by moving slowly or quickly. His eyes were fixed on Elias and the .357 Magnum pointed at him. He wore a pair of boxer shorts. I was oddly grateful for that small measure of dignity that was preserved. Once he stood, Elias ordered him to face away and go to his knees. As he turned, his blue eyes caught mine. They had almost passed me by, seeing just another cop in a raid vest, then recognition registered. He turned away too quickly for me to see anything else. I covered him while Elias put on the handcuffs. My jaw clenched at the sound of the ratcheting clicks. Meanwhile, the uniform swept through the rest of the small house. Elias paused, checked the tightness, and then used his cuff key to double lock the restraints. Officers hollered "clear" from all through the house. The adrenaline level in the place took a precipitous drop. Elias kept a hand on my brother's shoulder, and so he remained kneeling and facing the wall. I holstered my gun. I wanted to vomit, but I knew I wouldn't. Couldn't. Elias glanced back at me to check on me. I gave him my best rock-solid look back. Then he pointed at my brother's hands. I craned my neck forward, looked down at them, and shrugged. Elias removed a penlight from his pocket and shined it down on the cuffed hands. Flecks of blood were on the fingers, and a single dry smear sloped across the back of my brother's hand. I swallowed and said nothing. Cameron Whitaker from forensics came in a few moments later. Elias pointed at my brother's cuffed hands. Whitaker's eyebrows raised, and he nodded knowingly. Expertly, he slid paper evidence bags over both of my brother's hands, zip-tying them at the wrist to preserve the evidence. Still, I said nothing. Elias and my brother echoed my silence. The only sounds in the house were the low, muted cop conversations, the shuffling of feet, and the tinny tick of the cheap Walmart clock hanging above the bed. Finally, it was time to move him. Elias stood him up, and he cooperated. When he turned to face me, I expected a tear or two, but his eyes were dry. Sad, but dry. His hair was askew and his face haggard and drawn. He'd been big when he first got out of prison, but not anymore. The drugs had worn him down. He looked me directly in the eye. "Joey," he said, his voice even. "Frank," I said, and my voice was thin. Elias waited a moment out of respect to give us a chance to say whatever it was we had to say. I didn't know if there would be anything to say across the gulf of choices and time and loss that was between us. Maybe my brother felt the same way because he was quiet for a long moment. I saw Elias shift his weight to move forward and escort him from the room. But then my brother spoke, and Elias paused again. "You remember that record Dad used to play all the time?" he asked, his voice clear. I nodded. "That song, Joey. You remember that song?" I nodded again. Our dad played Springsteen's Nebraska over and over again when we were kids. We both must have heard it 1,000 times by the time we graduated in the late 80s and got out of that dark, depressing, motherless house. He made a big deal every time the song Highway Patrolman came on because it was about brothers and family. It was about a cop named Joe and his troubled brother, Frankie. It was never about us, I don't think, until we made ourselves into that song. "I got a brother named Frankie," my brother half sang, "and Frankie ain't no good." I swallowed and didn't answer. I hated that song. I hated this house. I hated going through that door, the absolute worst door I've ever had to pass through. When I didn't answer, Elias nudged my brother forward, and they left the room. My brother brushed by me, and I smelled the putrid odor of his addiction, the musk of the woman's sex that hung on him, and cigarettes. I breathed it in anyway, hoping and wishing for just a scant whiff of little boy hair that I remembered while we lay together and slept in the bedroom we shared as kids. "Nothing feels better than blood on blood," Springsteen's voice rasped in my head. I felt tears prickle in my eyes. I wiped them away and left the room. The worst door. Thank you.